Hey everyone, welcome to part 3 in the Lion and the Bat series. Today we're going to be working on the gold on the lion's armour. Now, we are going to be getting the gold to a nice finish as you can see on screen, but it's worth noting that for me, metallics are never done until the end. And the reason for that is they have really weird interactions, colour interactions and reflections with other surfaces. So I always try and get them to a point that they look good, but I haven't finished them off and given them a really nice perfect finish until I've painted more of the model. So I mean, you can see the gold on screen, it looks good. We're going for a really yellow polished gold, so what that means is generally our reflection points are going to be quite wide and there's not going to be a huge amount of secondary reflections. The reason why I've done it this way is because I love this piece of artwork of the duel between the lion and Kurz, and I'm trying to do my own interpretation of it, and I really wanted that bright yellow gold. So this is going to be how I've done the metallics. Now it is non-metal metallic. I do prefer painting that way, although I still do have a lot to learn myself. But I thought I'd show it off, and hopefully it's helpful. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. If you want commissions at all, or if you want some tuition, then feel free to get in touch with the links in the description for my Facebook, Instagram and my Patreon. Thanks very much. So first up, the gold areas are base coated with Rhinox Hide from GW, and then we're going to be working with Vallejo model color Japanese uniform, and this is what's going to give us the yellow to the actual non-metal metallic itself. So I'm working on the sword hilt, and I'm going to be working on the shoulder pads because they've got some interesting shapes to show off how I'm going to do this, especially with the lion's head. As I said, this is not going to be perfect. The whole point of this is getting it so it looks like a metal. Nice yellow gold metal. That's the goal. So first up, we've base coated all with Rhinox Hide. I'm, for all intents and purposes, colouring most of this metal in with Japanese uniform. The more Japanese uniform that we have down, the more yellow it's going to be towards the end. Now, the danger with this is potentially we're not going to have enough contrast, and by that I mean we're not going to have enough dark areas to show off a metallic effect, but that's something that's easily dealt with later down the line, and it's even easier to manage as part of that finishing process further along the model. But you're going to see how we do this. So this Japanese uniform, it's got good coverage, but it's for all intents and purposes a yellow going over a dark colour. So it has taken me 2 or 3 coats to cover up what I need to. For the time being, I'm just focusing on all the areas that are facing upwards or facing my light direction. There are small parts that I'm going to leave in Rhinox Hide, like the recessed gaps, but even then I'm not too worried about filling in the details because I can and I will fix them later. All I'm focusing on is the overall shape. So it's the same as when I always paint. When I painted the leg armor, not bothered about the details, just the shape of each object on its own. I'm going to say this a lot, if you break things down to simple shapes, it will make things much easier when it comes to choosing where your highlights should be. Don't be overly finicky. I know we paint small models, but as long as your paint is thin so it doesn't obscure details, don't worry about messing it up. The sooner you get rid of that fear of making mistakes, the sooner you're going to enjoy painting more, and the sooner you're going to get better quicker. The other thing is be brave. Don't worry about going too dark. You want, especially at 28mm scale, you want some extreme contrast. And what I mean by that, there are loads of different types of contrast, but the one that we're mainly going to be talking about as a general rule is your contrast between your darkest point and your lightest point. The reason why this is so important is because when we're painting something at such a small scale, we need to make everything extreme. We need to overemphasize everything. We emphasize the shape so people can see it. We emphasize the light and the shadows so it stands out, so it's easy to read. It's all about readability with a miniature. So just don't worry about it. go really bright and go really dark. It's easy to fix if it's too much. So we're onto the lion's head. Now, although we're looking for metallic shapes, we're looking for that extreme contrast. The reality is because we're going for a really yellow metal, we don't actually have a huge range from dark to light. And the other thing is we need to, this lion head also needs to be readable. We need to look at it and go, that's a lion's head. You need to clearly be able to see that. And if we treat it as a whole shape and keep a whole section in darkness, we're going to really struggle to make it so someone looks at that straight away and go, oh, that's a lion's head. I clearly see what it is. So for the time being, with this yellow, I'm going to cover this lion. But I'm also not painting into the recesses at the moment. That may come later. But the reason for this is I'm just picking out the fur. I'm picking out the ears, the fur being the main, obviously. I'm picking out the lion's head. There are certain parts that I'm leaving in complete darkness, like the lower jaw as an example, the inside of the mouth. The reason why I'm doing that is that's going to give you a bit of a frame. If we leave the inside of the mouth completely dark, it's clearly a mouth. If we paint that yellow, then actually that's going to have the problem of when you're looking at it from far away, it may confuse the actual shape of it. So you can clearly see this is taking 1 or 2 coats. I'm just going over it. I'm using the side of my brush like I would say an edge highlight, and I'm just running it along the side. It's a bit of a mix between a dry brush and an edge highlight, and I'm just catching that edge. And you can see it's already starting to build up. It doesn't look metallic at all, and it's not going to at this stage. If your metals are starting to look metallic already with this Japanese uniform, you've probably got too much Rhinox Hide showing through to get a yellow metal. But experiment with it because you might want a different result. I also wanted to point out, I'm getting a lot of questions about these gloves that I'm wearing in these videos. The gloves are not anything that helps with painting in any way. Basically, the reason why I wear them is I have a lot of pain with my hands. They put pressure on my thumbs, so it reduces the pain. So it's purely a medical thing, and you're probably going to see them in most videos. So if it annoys you like it does some people, tough. And these gloves do not help with painting whatsoever. If anything, they restrict the movement in my fingers. So you can see here, I've jumped back over to the other shoulder pad. You'll notice that I'm not actually painting much underneath. So I put a little bit of a secondary highlight underneath. This is like a bounce reflection. It's like a reflection that's coming from somewhere else. The only reason I'm really doing that is just so I've got something there to remind me. The reality is that's going to be coming back to at a later stage. And the reason why I'm not painting that the way I'm painting everything else right now is I'm going to put some different color into it. If I've got a bounce reflection, as in a reflection that's not coming from my main light source, potentially I can play around with the color on that and make it more interesting. Say for example, I don't know what color I'm going to do the cloak yet, but if the cloak is green on the inside, then I can put some green in that bounce reflection. It just adds interest. So you'll notice that there are parts of this model for the metallics that I am not painting. That's because when you're looking at a high quality model or a display piece or a centerpiece, it's the little details that are important, and that's going to happen further down the line. You need to get paint on the model and you need to sketch everything out like we're doing before you can really start working the details. Right, so this is the model with all the Japanese uniform down. You can see it's just ended up like a yellow mustardy colour. but that's fine. That's the basis of your yellow. So we're going to jump across to Vallejo model color Icy Yellow. This is where you're going to start getting your shine. So you can see that I'm thinning it down right now. I'm probably thinning it to, I think, 2 parts water to 1 part paint. This will stop it from obscuring all of your details, but you can clearly see on screen you still have a good coverage. You still have quite a lot of opaqueness to the paint. I'm also switching across to a smaller brush now. I want to be a bit more careful here. I want to think about creating shapes. This is where you should start seeing some kind of shiny effect. So instead of painting everywhere, I'm gonna pick out the points where I want to get a transition from that Japanese uniform to the icy yellow. So in this case, this shoulder pad, that whole bottom corner is going to be a reflective point. It's going to be a highlight area. And the reason for this is because remember, we're going for a polished finish. So we're not going to have really small highlights. We're going to have quite wide highlights because that gives the impression that the metal is less shiny but more of a polished finish. Now, if you go too far with it, it's really easy just to go back over this with the Japanese uniform or the Rhinox Hide. So again, don't worry about making mistakes. You can also see I'm being a bit more picky about going into those recesses just because I don't want to give myself any more work right now. The other important thing is you need to catch edges. You need to edge highlight. Metallic paints, or rather, sorry, metals will always catch edges. They do. It's a really important feature to sell a metallic surface, to sell a metallic impression. So you need to think about those edges. Sometimes it's more important to edge highlight. Well, it's nearly always more important to edge highlight to get a smooth transition, because sometimes with metals as well, it's better not to have a smooth transition because sometimes metals go from dark to light almost instantly. So sometimes hard lines are really good. You can see at the top of the shoulder pad here, although that top of the shoulder pad is all one piece, I'm still actually separating it like 2 separate edges because that will frame it. So you look at this shoulder pad, that whole corner, and it's quite a wide section of that corner, that's all effectively icy yellow, and I've just left Japanese uniform in the recesses. That is because, again, it's a polished metal. I want a wide reflection. I'm not going for super shiny that you see from the likes of Gareth Nichols. That's not the result that I want. It's amazing, but it'll look a bit odd on this model with the way I'm painting it. So just think about the finish that you personally want. If you're going for exactly the same that I've got, you're going to have quite wide highlights. If you're not, research the metals that you are supposed to be painting and have a look how they reflect. You might need to have much smaller highlights, reflection points, and you might need to have a lot more in a much shorter space. And you could already see it's looking metallic. That top part of the shoulder is looking like a metal. And I haven't done a huge amount. I haven't been hugely careful. I haven't used any special brush strokes or glazing. I've just used a semi-transparent paint. I've picked out the point that I want to highlight. In this case, it was that top corner of the shoulder. And I've edge highlighted the other areas around it. And you can see the result. Now, we're going to go brighter than this as well. But you can clearly see just by picking the points that you need and by framing your model, you will get a result. There's not even a huge amount of contrast in this. There's not a lot of dark. So I'm just jumping across to the sword hilt here. So I'm breaking this down into what is effectively a rectangle. So I've painted half of it with the ice yellow on that little part of the hilt. And then all I need to do is edge highlight around it. And that will give me a metallic result. And it's the same on the bottom part of the hilt. The only difference is I've highlighted on the inside of it, so that reflection or that highlight clearly is coming from the top. So we're now going to jump across to the lion's head shoulder pad. Now, I'm not going to lie, this is a bit of a challenge because it's so detailed. So with the shoulder trim itself, I'm doing exactly the same as I did on the other side. I'm picking that area that I want to be bright and I've painted it in. It's that simple. Now, the only thing that I would say is, for me personally, a symmetrical result is not as interesting as an asymmetrical result. So my highlight areas on this shoulder pad are different to the other shoulder pad. I've done it on purpose, firstly because the shoulder pad's in a different position. It's not sat in exactly the same way as the other one, but it just looks more interesting that way as well. And all I've done at first is I've just coloured in the area where I want to highlight, because I might have to change it depending on what the lion head looks like. So the first rule that I'm personally going off here is I'm working on the right side of the lion's head. The right side of the lion's head is the most important because that's the bit that's facing towards my light source. But that's not to say that you're not going to want to highlight the darker side as well. You need to just think about the overall shapes that you have of the shoulder pad. The shoulder pad itself, in theory, is just a sphere. So you're going to work it like a sphere, or you're going to highlight it like a sphere. But you also need to pick out the details. So what I found with this is it's more important to focus around framing the lion. So what I mean by that is, when we put the Japanese uniform down, the Japanese uniform picked out all the details. It gave the lion definition. Now, what we want to do is emphasize that even more. So you can see the head itself, the face, the jaw. What we're going to be doing is I've effectively painted all of that with this icy yellow, because I want the whole thing really bright, because in theory it's a big feature and it is sticking out. The majority of those surfaces are going to catch the light. The difference is as you can see, that I'm leaving Japanese uniform in the recesses and on some of the flat areas. So if I can leave a gap for some Japanese uniform, I am, because that's going to keep my nice yellow tone and it's going to give me some contrast between light and dark, and that's really important. With this fur as well, I'm not picking out all of the fur. I'm not picking out every piece. When you look at the mane of fur, or whatever it's called, the way it's sculpted, the mane is sculpted in shapes. So there will be 4, 5, 6 pieces of hair which all flow in the same shape. So what I'm doing is I'm breaking them down into those shapes, and I'm highlighting those shapes at the brightest points, and I'm trying to do that to frame those shapes so it gives a clear definition of what the mane looks like. With the lower jaw, I'm also only touching the upper edges. I don't want to go anywhere near the darkest. And as you can see, at the moment it doesn't look metallic too much, but you can clearly see a lion's head, and we clearly have enough contrast for a nice defined shape. Now I do end up going over the half that's in shadow as well. The difference there is I'm not going to go over it as much. My marks are much smaller, and all I'm doing on this side is I'm picking out certain strands of hair and I'm highlighting them towards the point that they stick out the most. So this side will be nowhere near as bright as the lead-in side. And you can see on there that my blends are still not smooth. I've just sketched in that ice yellow on the trim because I don't know how much I'm going to have to adjust it with. So I'm putting the sword back on. Obviously I need to take the sword on and off to actually get to the model, but this is really important. I'm putting the sword back on so I can see this shoulder pad in context to the rest of the model, because my light placement needs to make sense with the rest of it, especially that arm and that shoulder pad. So you can already see this shoulder pad over here on the front. We got a really nice result on that actually. That looks really good. It's looking metallic already. With the lion shoulder pad, the trim itself is looking metallic. The lion itself isn't, but it's being sold a little bit. The lion is better than it actually is because the trim around it looks metal and it's all uniform together. So what you have around something will also help sell a result. Next up, we just need to soften some of these transitions that we've made where I haven't been very careful, and I've just been putting down that Icy Yellow. I've just jumped back to the Japanese uniform for two reasons. Because firstly, remember the Japanese uniform is the source of your actual yellow color. Icy Yellow desaturates the gold and will make it look very white, but I want that yellow tone to it, remember, from the artwork. So going back to the Japanese uniform, I'm still not being very thin, to be honest with you. This is 2 parts Japanese uniform to 2 parts water to 1 part Japanese uniform. All I'm doing is the edges of where I've placed the Icy Yellow. I'm working from the inside of the Icy Yellow going back into the Japanese uniform. This softens the transition between the Icy Yellow and the Japanese uniform, and it adds some yellow tint to it, and it brings back that gold yellow armor that I was after. Right, so this is it as it stands, where I've blended back some of the yellow to give it some nice colour and soften the edges of those transitions. So what I'm going to do now is get some Rhinox Hide. Now I've thinned this down to 3 parts water, 1 part Rhinox Hide, and I'm just going back and I'm redefining the details. So these shoulder pads have, I don't know what they are, but they've got like little squares in them with rivets and circle things everywhere. I don't know what they are, so I'm just going around the rivets. So I'm framing them so the rivets don't get lost in the actual shape of the armor itself. And then with the rest of it, I'm just dropping this into the recesses and I'm painting it in so it frames the details in it. Now I don't want to go over the yellow or the Japanese uniform or the Icy Yellow. The Rhinox Hide will muddy them and it will make them look dirty. So be careful with this bit. Get a nice point on your brush. Get your paint on your brush. Pull your brush along your finger or your kitchen roll and twist it as you go to get that nice point. Before you put that brush on that model, test your brush mark on your finger or your kitchen roll or something like that so you can see what your brush is going to do. That way, if it's wrong, you're going to make a mistake off the model and not on the model. Remember, when you're doing detail work especially, test your brush stroke beforehand. It's really important. That way, you give yourself less work. I'm going to skip ahead with all of this because it is really tedious, so I'm going to time lapse it for you. You can just see what I'm doing. So you can see I'm painting the lion's head here. Now, it's really important that I talk about this. Remember when I said to you how the lion head has been sculpted? The sculptor has sculpted this mane, so he's sculpted shapes, overall shapes of a group of fur, a grouping of fur, and then he's added basically fur into that grouping. So there is actually larger shapes within the fur in the mane. Now what I'm doing is I'm picking out those larger shapes and I'm just going darker around those shapes, because what that will do is it will give it definition, and it will frame and make this lion more interesting. It's the same as where the mane hits the head, where the mane of hair joins the actual face of the lion. I've gone darker at those points because then that frames the lion's face itself and separates it from the mane. If you look on your model, you'll see it. You can break down the lion's mane into shapes, and you want to define those shapes. And it's the same as the ears. The lion's got obviously 2 ears, but the 2 ears are in the mane of hair, and I've painted around those ears because that defines those ears. Remember, we're looking at when a model is so small, especially 28mm, it can be very difficult to actually see what is in front of you and define what bits are what. So you want to frame them so as soon as you look at them, it's very easy to see. It makes it readable. So next up, Vallejo model color Ivory. You can see it on the wet palette. This is thinned quite a fair bit actually, so probably 3 parts water to 1 part paint, but you do whatever works for yourself. Remember, there's no the consistency of what you want is how you like to paint. There's no right answer to it. There's no golden ratio. So what I'm doing here, this isn't going to be our very brightest point, but we need to be very careful about how much we put on. So the brightest points of our reflection, I'm edge highlighting. So that corner of that shoulder pad where the light is the strongest, I'm catching the edges. I don't actually want to paint over much of anything else because this is basically an off-white. It's really close to white. And you just want to use it to make your brightest points pop. Be very sparing with it. Don't use a huge amount. This is what's going to give you a really nice shine. You can see here I've just gone back a little bit with some Rhinox Hide because that corner's a bit messy and I forgot about it, so ignore that. But yeah, so this is where I'm working with the Ivory. I'm picking out the brightest points, but it's really, really small. Don't use a lot. You just want to get your shiniest point, your brightest point, and you want to emphasize it. That's it. If you use too much, you will lose the yellow, and also if you use too much, it will actually stop it from being shiny. You'll just turn it to an ivory color. You're looking for a very small point. I can't stress this enough. If you use too much, if you put too much on the model, you will lose the shiny effect and it will just look like you're painting an ivory shoulder pad or an ivory part of trim. Less is definitely much more here. Right, so we're just going over to the lion quickly. So we're still on this ivory. The difference with the lion, even, what we need to do is you need to pick out very small points. So in my case, what I did was I picked out the points where the lion, parts of the lion head curved and it peaked at the top. So for example, around the snout, the mouth, I'm not sure what you call it, just the top sections I painted in the ivory, just where the light would hit it the most. It's the same as those curves of the fur. I've also picked out just the peak of those curves just to make it brighter. I'm also not touching the underside of the shoulder pad as well because I don't want it to shine that much. So the tip of the ear as well, the eyebrow, where the curve of the eyebrow peaks is also where I've picked out. Another thing to think about is if we break this shoulder pad down into one simple shape, for all intents and purposes it's a sphere. So if we say the lion's head is the brightest point of that sphere, then the lion's head is also going to be the brightest, and that's how I've worked it. So remember, break your model down into shapes, it'll make it much easier to work out where you should be highlighting or what those highlights should look like. So very last step, we are putting down white. This is 1 part water to 1 part white. You can use a white of your choice. This is Vallejo model color white. All we are doing is we are placing dots at the very brightest point. Don't go any bigger than a dot. You just want a dot of white because this is your very last highlight point. This is your brightest area. It's also worth noting, normally I wouldn't actually do this at this stage. This would be done once the whole model is painted, and then I would go around the whole model and pick out the brightest points where I just wanted to place a dot. But I think it's better to show you as part of the gold. As you can see, the gold is now looking like it fits with everything else that I've done. Remember, the white dot is just that shine point. You don't need anything more than that. Less is more in this case. And that's it, our yellow gold non-metal metallic. So there are still adjustments that I'm gonna make on both the armor and the gold, to be fair, at the end. So what I'll probably do is at the end of the series, or at the end of the lion section of the series, because we've still got curs to paint and we've still got the base to paint, I will probably do an entire video based around just going around the model and adjusting and tweaking everything so it comes together, because I think that's quite important when we're looking at high quality pieces. There's always a certain amount of adjustment towards the end, whether that's just adjusting a nice transition or adjusting a full color or giving some interest to the actual paintwork itself. But that'll be a separate video. I hope this was helpful. If it was, please like and subscribe. We've got plenty more to come. This is going to be quite a long video series for this with curs. So yeah, thanks very much.